Some paintings are admired, others are studied, but a rare few do something far more unsettling. They do not simply hang on a wall waiting to be appreciated. They reach out and grab the viewer by the throat. They disturb, overwhelm, and refuse to let go. The Raft of the Medusa by Théodore Géricault belongs to that rare category. It is not just a painting, it is a confrontation, a vast, chaotic, deeply human nightmare stretched across canvas. At first glance, it looks like a scene of shipwrecked men clinging to life on a crude raft in the middle of a violent sea. But the longer you stare, the more horrifying it becomes. This is not simply a maritime disaster. It is a portrait of abandonment, desperation, political failure, and the terrifying fragility of hope. And what makes it even more haunting is that it was inspired by a real event so scandalous and so disturbing that it shook France to its core. To understand why this painting struck such a nerve, we have to go back to 1816, just after the fall of Napoleon. France was trying to rebuild itself under a restored monarchy, and with that restoration came a wave of political favoritism. Important positions were often handed out, not to the most capable people, but to the most loyal. One of those appointments would prove catastrophic. A naval officer named Hughes de Roy de Chaumeris, a man who had little recent seafaring experience, was given command of the French frigate Medusa. His appointment had more to do with royal connections than competence. That alone might have been embarrassing. Instead, it became deadly. The Medusa was part of a small fleet headed toward the coast of West Africa, carrying soldiers, officials, and civilians to the French colony of Senegal. More than 400 people were on board. What should have been a routine voyage quickly turned into a disaster. Chaumeris ignored the advice of more experienced officers and steered the ship recklessly off course. On July 2nd, 1816, the Medusa ran aground on a sandbank off the coast of present-day Mauritania. At first, there was still hope. The ship had not immediately sunk, and the passengers believed they would be rescued or brought safely to shore. But what followed revealed just how thin the line between civilization and savagery can be. There were not enough lifeboats for everyone. Faced with that problem, the officers devised a desperate solution. A massive raft was hastily built from parts of the ship, roughly 20 meters long and barely stable enough to float. It was never meant to carry so many people, yet around 150 men and one woman were forced onto it. The official plan was that the lifeboats would tow the raft to safety, but almost as soon as the convoy began to move, panic, selfishness, and fear took over. The ropes connecting the raft to the boats were cut. Whether it was done out of deliberate cruelty or cowardly self-preservation, the result was the same. The people on the raft were abandoned in the open sea, with almost no food, almost no water, and almost no chance of survival. That is the true horror behind Géricault's painting. It is not simply about a shipwreck. It is about betrayal. These were not people defeated only by nature. They were sacrificed by other human beings, cast away by the very society that was supposed to protect them. And once they were left adrift, the descent into hell began almost immediately. During the first night alone, waves swept men overboard. Fights broke out. Some were trampled. Others were killed in panic and confusion. The raft pitched violently in the ocean, half submerged, unstable, and packed with terrified bodies. There was nowhere to sit comfortably, nowhere to sleep, nowhere to escape the cold, the salt, the hunger, or the fear. As the days passed, the survivors were stripped not only of comfort, but of identity. Rank no longer mattered. Status disappeared. Titles became meaningless. Out there on the sea, everyone was reduced to the same raw truth: survive or die. This is the emotional world Géricault wanted to capture. He was not interested in painting a neat historical illustration or a patriotic fantasy. He wanted to drag the viewer directly into that unbearable human moment, into the physical and psychological collapse of people pushed beyond every limit. And that is what makes The Raft of the Medusa so powerful. It does not show us the beginning of the tragedy, and it does not show us its end. Instead, it traps us in the most agonizing part of all, the moment when hope still exists, but only barely. The moment when salvation might be possible, but is so distant and uncertain that it almost feels cruel. What makes The Raft of the Medusa so unforgettable is not just the story behind it, but the way Géricault transforms that story into pure emotional architecture. Every figure, every shadow, every gesture is arranged with an almost surgical understanding of human suffering. At first, The scene appears chaotic, almost impossible to process, but the more carefully you look, the more deliberate it becomes. This is not a random pile of bodies tossed together by chance. It is a carefully constructed vision of despair rising, step by step, toward one final, fragile spark of hope. Géricault organizes the painting like a living pyramid. At the base lie the dead and the nearly dead, bodies slumped, twisted, and surrendered to gravity. Their limbs are heavy, their skin pale, their forms collapsing into one another like the remains of a world already lost. Above them are the dying, men who are still technically alive but whose strength has almost completely abandoned them. And at the very top, balanced precariously against the sky, are those who still have enough strength to hope. This upward movement is one of the painting's greatest achievements. It is not only visual, but psychological. Your eye is pulled from the darkness of death at the bottom to the feverish urgency at the top, where several survivors stretch themselves toward a tiny ship visible on the horizon. That ship is the Argus, the vessel that would eventually rescue the last remaining survivors. But in the painting, it is little more than a speck that is crucial. Géricault does not give us the comfort of certainty. He does not paint rescue as guaranteed. He paints it as almost unbearably distant. The men on the raft are not celebrating. They are pleading. They are straining every last fragment of life toward a possibility that may vanish at any second. The painting lives inside that tension, between collapse and survival, between resignation and refusal. The central figure near the top, waving frantically with a piece of cloth, becomes the emotional climax of the entire composition. He is not triumphant, he is desperate. His body is extended with a force that feels almost painful to witness, as if hope itself requires violence to remain alive. Around him, others lift themselves with the same exhausted urgency, stacking their bodies and wills together in one final attempt to be seen. But below them, the painting refuses to let us forget the cost of that effort. Fathers cradle dead sons. Men stare blankly into nothingness. Corpses lie tangled among the living, no longer separate from life and death are no longer opposites here. They are intertwined, touching, leaning against one another, existing on the same fragile surface of wood in the middle of an indifferent sea. And then there's the ocean itself. In many shipwreck paintings, the sea is dramatic, violent, almost theatrical. But here, it feels colder than that, more merciless. It is not simply a force of nature. It is emptiness. Géricault paints the water and sky with a heaviness that makes the world feel endless and closed at the same time. The horizon offers no comfort. The clouds seem to press down on the raft, trapping the figures in a universe where there is no stable ground, no sanctuary, no guarantee of justice. Even the light in the painting is conflicted. It illuminates bodies in a way that recalls classical heroic art. Yet what it reveals is not heroism in the traditional sense. It reveals exhaustion, fear, grief, and the raw vulnerability of flesh. This contrast is part of what makes the painting so unsettling. It borrows the visual language of glory only to expose the horror underneath. Géricault was obsessed with getting this right. He did not paint the scene casually or from imagination alone. He immersed himself in the tragedy with an intensity that bordered on madness. He interviewed survivors of the Medusa disaster. He studied official reports. He built a scale model of the raft in his studio. He visited hospitals and morgues to study dying bodies and decomposing flesh, so he could represent death with terrifying accuracy. Some accounts even suggest he brought severed limbs and body parts into his workspace in order to understand the textures and colors of decay. That level of commitment was not just artistic ambition. It was a refusal to romanticize suffering. Géricault wanted truth, even if that truth was ugly enough to repel people, and in doing so, he broke away from what history painting had usually been. At the time, large-scale paintings were expected to celebrate noble victories, heroic leaders, or mythological grandeur. But the raft of the Medusa offered none of that. There is no glorious commander at the center, no divine intervention, no clean moral resolution. Instead, Géricault took ordinary people, many of them anonymous, many of them broken, and gave them the scale and intensity usually reserved for kings and saints. That decision was radical. He was saying, in effect, that human suffering deserved to be seen with the same seriousness as triumph, that failure, injustice, and desperation were not beneath great art. They were at its center. When the Raft of the Medusa was first exhibited in 1819, people did not simply look at it as a technical achievement. They understood immediately that it was dangerous, not dangerous because of violence alone, but because of what it exposed. This was not just a painting about dead and dying men at sea. It was a massive public indictment of the French state, of aristocratic incompetence, of a society willing to sacrifice the powerless and then pretend it was an accident. Everyone in France knew about the Medusa scandal. Newspapers had already turned it into a national embarrassment. The survivors' testimonies had circulated widely, horrifying the public with accounts of starvation, madness, mutiny, murder, and cannibalism. The event had become more than a shipwreck. It had become a symbol of what happens when authority is handed to the undeserving, and when ordinary people are treated as expendable. Géricault took that outrage and transformed it into something impossible to ignore. He put it on a giant canvas and forced an entire nation to stare at it. That is part of what makes this painting feel so modern even today. It is not trapped in the past. It still speaks the language of betrayal, institutional failure, and human abandonment with terrifying clarity. You do not need to know anything about 19th century France to feel what this image is saying. The message is immediate. There are always rafts. There are always people left behind. There are always systems that protect the comfortable while sacrificing the vulnerable. And there are always those final moments when the abandoned are forced to look toward the horizon and wonder whether anyone will come for them at all. This is why the painting continues to disturb people 2 centuries later. It is not only historical, it is timeless. And yet, despite all its darkness, the Raft of the Medusa is not purely a painting of death. That would almost be easier to process. Pure tragedy can be absorbed, labeled, and set aside. What makes this work unbearable is that it refuses to extinguish hope completely. It keeps hope alive, just enough to make the suffering more painful. The tiny ship in the distance changes everything. Without it, the raft would be a tomb. With it, the painting becomes something even more agonizing, a test, a suspended instant in which everything hangs on whether the survivors will be seen or ignored. That uncertainty is what gives the painting its pulse. You are not just looking at body, you are looking at the human will, stretched to its absolute limit, refusing to disappear quietly. There is also something deeply psychological in the way the painting affects us. It forces us into a position we may not want to admit. We are not on the raft. We are the distant observers. We are the ones standing safely outside the suffering, looking at it from shore, from a museum, from history, from comfort. That creates a disturbing moral tension. The men in the painting are trying to be seen, and we are the ones who see them. But what does it mean to witness suffering after the fact? Is looking enough? Is remembering enough? Géricault seems to suggest that the act of seeing carries responsibility. Once you have truly looked at this image, once you understand what it represents, you can no longer pretend that disaster is always natural or that tragedy is always random. Sometimes people drown because someone else made a choice. That is why the painting feels larger than its subject. It is about survival, yes, but it is also about power, about whose lives are protected and whose lives are disposable, about what remains of morality when institutions collapse and the body becomes more urgent than the soul. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is about the thinness of civilization itself. We like to believe that human dignity is permanent, that reason and order are stronger than chaos. But the Raft of the Medusa offers a far more frightening truth. Under enough pressure, under enough hunger, fear, and abandonment, all the structures we rely on begin to crack. The painting does not ask whether that is comfortable. It simply shows it. And still, even after all that horror, what lingers most is not the death. It is the reaching, the stretching upward, the refusal to surrender completely. That is the final contradiction at the heart of this masterpiece. It is one of the bleakest paintings ever made, and yet it remains charged with an almost unbearable pulse of life, not because it promises salvation, but because it captures the human instinct to keep signaling into the void even when rescue feels impossible, to keep wobbling, to keep standing, to keep believing, if only for one more second, that someone might see you. Maybe that is why the painting still grips us so powerfully, not just because it shows us what happened on that raft, but because it reveals something we recognize in ourselves. The fear of being abandoned, the terror of becoming invisible, and the stubborn, painful, almost irrational need to hope anyway. The Raft of the Medusa is not just a masterpiece because it is beautiful or shocking or historically important. It is a masterpiece because it tells a truth most people spend their lives trying not to think about. That survival is not noble. Hope is not clean. And sometimes the most human thing a person can do is simply refuse to let the sea have the last word.